The Nobel Prize for Economics was shared this year between three economists who explored the relationship between innovation and economic growth. Joel Mokyr won the award for, quote, having identified the prerequisites for sustained growth through technological progress. And Philippe Aghion and Peter Howitt won for the theory of sustained growth through creative destruction. Now, Aghion and Howitt's work is highly technical, above my pay grade, probably not great for a YouTube show. Joel Mokyr, though, is a very readable historian of the Industrial Revolution, and I thought it would be interesting to do a segment on his work. Mokyr has dedicated his life to writing about how, according to his account, it was the culture of creating useful knowledge and invention that powered the Industrial Revolution, which then led to over 2 centuries of sustained growth. And I knew exactly who to speak to explain and to defend his ideas. Anton Howes is a historian of innovation who writes the Age of Invention blog. It's currently the 29th most popular history Substack. And I caught up with Anton Howes earlier today, and I asked him to introduce the work of Joel Mokyr.
So Joel Mokyr is an economic historian. His main work, or the work that he'd won the Sveriges Riksbank Prize, commonly called the Economics Nobel Prize for, was very much to do with the causes of the British Industrial Revolution. And the reason that's important is we want to know why it is that we get sustained, what's often called modern economic growth. So this isn't the kind of jumps in GDP that you see throughout most of history. This is the kind of 1 to 2% every year, year on year, with a few dips occasionally. There's the occasional recession, but ultimately living standards continue to improve and improve and improve and improve and improve, which is something that's happened for the past few hundred years or so. And so all of Mokyr's work, really since I think about at least the 80s, and there are smatterings of it before, has been about trying to explain that question, which is a very difficult thing for a lot of economists to explain because you really do need to delve into the history of it. So what's quite exciting about this Nobel win for Mokyr is that essentially it's for work in history, the kind of stuff that doesn't even necessarily get published in some of the top 5 economics journals nowadays, the kind of stuff that tends to get published in books, in very readable papers. I mean, there's still some pretty technical stuff. I should say that Mokyr's early work was very, really kind of trailblazing when it came to some of the quantitative technical things that you now see published all the time. But ultimately, to answer the question the way that he answers the question, it has to necessarily be very qualitative. And the reason for that is that he thinks that the cause of the Industrial Revolution has to be down to improvements in technology. It has to be a kind of careful study of how technology develops, how innovation develops. And ultimately, in order to explain the kind of sheer scale of things that's happening across the Industrial Revolution, and I should mention here, it's not just about things like cotton, coal, steam engines, iron. When you see economic growth happening for the past few hundred years, but even in that kind of very early stage in the 18th and early 19th centuries, you're seeing it across the board. You're seeing it in ceramics, you're seeing it in agriculture, you're seeing it in the kind of decorations that people put onto textiles, you're seeing it in food processing, you're seeing it in industry after industry after industry after industry. And so to explain the kind of breadth of innovation that you see taking place, ultimately he thinks, he argues, and I agree with this as well, is that ultimately it has to come down to changes in ideas, changes in, you might say, culture, although in a way it's kind of more subcultures of inventors, of people, of mechanicians, of engineers, and what it is they're up to. And so there's, as you can tell, this is a huge question to be answering. It's very much one that he has a very particular take on, which a lot of economists are kind of uncomfortable with because they would prefer there to be prices and graphs for them to kind of hook onto. It's also something that a lot of people in history, kind of on the history side of economic history, or people who are historians approaching economic history without an economics background, are also kind of uncomfortable with because there are various other explanations that they also tend to prefer, which are often also very rooted in material factors. So to have this kind of more ideas-based explanation for the Industrial Revolution, one that did used to have a very long tradition, well back into the early 20th century and late 19th century as well, is kind of a very interesting choice for the Nobel Committee to have gone for.
I want to talk about those alternative theories in a moment. because there are lots of people who would critique Mokyr, say it's a bit Whiggish, it's Eurocentric. Lots of these arguments I want to put you in one moment. First of all, I just want to get a handle of exactly what Mokyr thought happened. What did change? What was the thing that allowed these in his, in his works? The idea is that we have this scientific culture, this culture of tinkerers and engineers, and a sort of productive relationship between people in the natural sciences and engineering and technology, and that leads to take-off growth. So I suppose before we go into the alternatives, flesh out a bit more what he thinks changes, when, how.
Sure. So I think one of the key things, as you've kind of alluded to there, is that you have this alliance, this necessary alliance between people who have what you might call propositional knowledge. So scientists, people observing the way that the world works, or kind of having this kind of general sense of relationships in the natural world. And then people who have prescriptive knowledge, people who, in the same way that you might follow a recipe, you can very easily kind of make a thing, you can make a meal to a pretty high degree, potentially, without necessarily understanding the chemical processes that are going on within it. And so he thinks a lot of the growth that occurs over the course of the 18th century, this kind of takeoff that you see, is that you already had very anciently lots of scientists, you had very anciently lots of people with great mechanical skills, knowing how to make lots of very complicated things, blacksmiths, tanners, these are all extremely complicated processes. But through this alliance of the two, by creating institutions, scientific societies, lots of publishing, openness, creating institutions like patents that require a bit of kind of revealing of certain techniques, so they're not just kept secret all the time. Through a lot of these sorts of institutions, you start to see this sort of alliance between the heads and the hands, right? The people who know a lot of stuff and the people who actually do a lot of the stuff. So you do have societies like France, for example, where you've got loads of great scientists throughout the 18th century. You see a lot of mechanicians in Germany at the same time. But it's in Britain uniquely that you seem to have this alliance between the two, where the scientists or people can be both a scientist and a tinker at the same time. Someone like James Watt, for example, the improver of the steam engine in the late 18th century, revolutionizes quite literally, gets it to do circular motion in a reliable way. And he is, you could argue, both a scientist, someone who really knows the science very well, and also someone who is extremely good with his hands, extremely good at tinkering, extremely good at creating things in a kind of much more manual, mechanical kind of way as well. So Britain kind of takes off as a result of this alliance between the two. And so you get this sort of expansion of useful knowledge. And the larger the base of useful knowledge you have, the larger kind of, if you like, the peak of the pyramid of economic growth of improving living standards can be, right? So you need to have this base of useful knowledge in order to have the kind of innovation-led growth that we've seen for the past few hundred years. Most of that takes place over the course of, you could argue it kind of goes back to, and Mokyr would argue late 17th century. I would actually go even further back, but we can set that to one side. Over the course of the 18th century is when you start to see this really taking off in Britain, which is why you start to see Britain having remarkably higher living standards, not just in the rest of Europe, but the rest of the world as well.
Talk about the criticisms and the alternatives. I have to say, I've started reading more about this since this Nobel Prize. So I've bought my Pomerantz, The Great Divergence, to sort of read the alternatives. So he's someone who argued that actually, if you just look at Europe, it's quite easy to tell this story of there was an advancement in ideas, there was the Enlightenment. You can go back to sort of rationalism and Aristotle, and then look at the Romans. You can tell this sort of self-enclosed story where history was sort of moving in this direction towards the Europeans having the Enlightenment and having what he calls the Industrial Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and that's why it happened here. Maybe that's a butchering of Mokyr's work to some degree, but sort of he's critiquing that tradition. And he says that actually, if you look at the most advanced parts of Asia in the 17th, 18th centuries, so the Yangtze Delta, I think he suggests parts of India, Japan, they had just as much inventiveness, just as much sort of debate between scientists and the like. They had incomes which were just as high. Their irrigation was even better than ours, for example. And what really made the difference is that when you have proto-industrialism, you end up meeting resource constraints. So you end up, if you've got people working in industry, that increases the relative prices of agriculture. And that was a barrier to growth in Japan, in China. And what meant that in the West we could take off wasn't necessarily because we had better ideas. It's because, one, we had very good luck, which is that it turned out we had coal deposits which were easily accessible. And two, we were very violent, which meant that we were sort of able to go and colonize the New World, which gave us access to vast natural resources and also very cheap primary goods because of the slave trade. So I suppose that puts the Industrial Revolution happening in Britain in a slightly more, let's say, ambiguous light in terms of what it means and how proud we can feel of it, let's say, than Mokyr's version. So what's his response to that alternative? I suppose, what's your response to that alternative? Why would we go for Mokyr over Pomerantz?
Yeah, it's. I think you've chosen the exact right person to be the kind of anti-Mokyr take. Although I will actually point out that Pomerantz's big book that is so convincing to both economic historians and historians was also one that Mokyr edited as part of his series for Princeton University Press. So I know there's a kind of tendency to say, oh, a lot of his work is so Eurocentric, but actually he's been actively engaging with the other side, throughout this whole over the course of decades, and it has actually been trying to keep alive there being a conversation rather than two different fields talking past one another. Since Pomerantz made his argument, which I think will have been over 10 years ago at this point, there has been a bit of a weakening of this idea that the Yangtze Delta is quite as rich as it was thought to be at the time. So some of that data seems to have looked a little bit shakier. One other aspect is that he has this emphasis on coal, and I think actually coal in many ways is in some respects underrated as something that can be a very material factor when it comes to economic growth. Coal doesn't explain the sheer range of inventions that you see over the course of the 18th century. There are absolutely loads of, I mentioned, from agriculture to ceramics to watchmaking. A lot of these things have very little, if nothing, to do with coal at all. But that said, it can also be something that, in some ways that I think have also even been missed by people like Mokyr, the kind of very important material factor for increasing living standards. Energy, as we know today, right, through having kind of very constrained energy, really does matter a great deal. On the colonies point, there's the kind of interesting argument here that Pomerantz makes, that essentially China doesn't have a new world to exploit in the same way. That said, it does have very large, what's often referred to as peripheries to exploit. There is this massive westward expansion. There is this expansion up the coast. Manchuria very much gets colonized. Or kind of recolonized, considering the Qing dynasty is itself from Manchuria after 1644. You do see quite a bit of expansion in order to obtain more raw materials. But one of the things that I think there's a big disagreement between economic historians who are kind of from a more economics bent and those from a more history bent is this question about counterfactuals, right? Which is, if we try to remove a particular good, if we try to remove a particular raw material, how do we account for that, right? And I think historians often have this tendency to say, well, look, the slave trade is massive. As a result of it being massive, it obviously was important. And economists will say, well, hang on, we actually need, when we try to look at counterfactuals, what we actually need to do is kind of, what is the next kind of most valuable thing that they would have done instead if you were to take that away? So there has been quite a bit of work on coal, for example, looking at the impact on economic growth. So the thought experiment here is if we were to imagine that all of the coal they instead used Baltic wood, let's say, so the wood, so certainly from a kind of peripheral region, but if we replaced all of Britain's coal deposits with wood imported from the Baltic, obviously that's costlier than using coal, but it turns out that the change in growth isn't quite as large as you would expect it to be. And you can do a pretty similar thing when it comes to the impact of particular colonies. So remember that a lot of the most valuable colonies were sugar colonies. Sugar is not a huge input into a lot of other industries. And once you remove it from the equation, there are actually, it doesn't tend to have that large an impact on GDP. So I think a lot of the disagreement that you start to see between these two two camps often comes down to how they treat counterfactuals, whether they think that use of counterfactuals is kind of legitimate use. But I think that's the kind of main argument that you tend to see from Mokyr, from the Mokyr side, or from other economic historians as well.
I mean, I'll try and get Pomerantz on the show to put forward his vision more articulately than I can. But I mean, just in terms of sort of the Chinese example, they also had their own peripheries. His argument, as far as I understand from what I've read of the book, is that the reason you needed forced labor in the peripheries is because if you've sort of got proto-industrialism, so you're beginning to move up the value chain, to use sort of a more modern way of talking about this, then your peripheries, once you start importing wood or food or whatever from them, they will begin themselves to rise up the value chain, and they're no longer this source of cheap raw inputs. And you're going to end up having to move more of your resources to intensively farming your own land, because proto-industrialism comes with population growth. And so he's saying that the way to make this work is you have forced exchange with people who can't move up the value chain, and that's why colonialism and the sort of mandatory trade that happened there. The Indians weren't allowed to move up the value chain, and of course, in the slave trade, that was labor which was artificially kept incredibly cheap. So, what do you think about that sort of argument about the necessary relationship between violence and industrialization? Because otherwise, you can't guarantee the periphery, which allows the core to focus on those sort of industrial sectors which allow takeoff to happen.
It's an interesting argument. I actually think there is a big problem with it, though, which is that if you look at kind of periods in history later on, like in the 19th century, when the steamboat essentially opens up, as well as things like refrigeration and various other technologies, just completely opens up world trade, so that parts of the world that never will have been able to trade bulk goods, let's say grain, is suddenly able to sell on the other side of the world. So you actually do get competition of basic commodities. What you actually tend to see in these kind of very short, sharp shocks, if you like, it's almost a kind of perfect experiment of exactly what you're saying. That when you have the great big demand for raw materials, what tends to happen to an economy? What you actually tend to see is that those economies almost naturally specialize in producing those goods. Right, that those people who own the means of production within those economies tend to say, oh, great, I could get even more money than I did before for my sugar, or for my, in South America, guano, or for my grain. You don't actually require necessarily people within the core to be enforcing it. You actually see it in an earlier period as well, in the 16th century. I mentioned the Baltic as being a source of wood. It is also the breadbasket for most of Europe, not just for Britain. Britain actually is also tends to be a net exporter of grain in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. But the Dutch Republic, a lot of its growth is very much based on Baltic grain. Renaissance Italy is very much based on Baltic grain. It's not like the Dutch and the Italians are, sending troops into the Baltic to make sure that they produce a lot of grain. No, simply that if you have a very wealthy economy, like in the Netherlands, like in northern Italy, they can outbid the locals, if you like, in terms of how they should be, what they should be doing with their land. So what you tend to see is something more akin to what economists refer to as Dutch disease. Kind of ironically, I suppose now, given I don't think Dutch disease ever actually happened to the Netherlands, but it's this kind of specialization in a very, very valuable good, often at the expense of industry. So there is a bit of a debate, for example, about late 19th century India. There are purposeful kind of mercantilist, colonial mercantilist thinkers in Britain who are saying, yes, we should absolutely do some forced deindustrialization. But the extent to which it's actually necessary is, I think, is a slightly different question. So certainly you see the United States, for example, before it becomes the United States, you see people like Benjamin Franklin saying, I really wish these Brits would stop subsidizing things like hemp production, or all of these subsidies they have for raw materials in the 13 colonies. If only we could have our own manufacturers instead of having this kind of forced, as you say, kind of pushing us down the value chain as much as possible. But I think there are actually factors within the American economy that are already pushing for manufacturing in a way that you don't necessarily automatically see in a lot of other peripheries. And it's also a bit debatable the extent to which specialization like that is necessary. in that sometimes having larger markets for exported goods is just as important a factor. So interestingly, one of the things that's happened since Pomerantz wrote is that a lot of the debate around the slave trade or the role of slavery has actually moved away from the economic benefits directly of the slave trade, or rather, directly of sugar, because those are pretty small percentages of total GDP in Britain. What you intend to see instead is people saying, well, slaves in South Carolina, let's say, they're purchasing linen clothes that is manufactured in Britain, and therefore it's kind of stimulating the linen industry, or it's stimulating industry within Britain itself, or copper production in Anglesey, for example, is very much stimulated by the needs of all those copper kettles and boilers that you require for boiling the sugar in the Caribbean. But if that's the case, then you could also argue that a lot of demand for those sorts of manufactured goods is likely to be much greater in places where you have a much wealthier society in general, rather than one that's being pushed down the value chain. So I think there are sort of certain inconsistencies in the way that that narrative, or not narrative, but the way that arguments, the debate has been moving along.
It's presumably the slave owners buying the cotton, right? Not the slaves themselves. They presumably didn't have any money to purchase cotton from.
Well, it's to clothe slaves, though. So it's linen to be put onto slaves' backs.
Let's move up to the present. I will email Pomerantz and try and get him on. Mokyr, I think, he's talking about the origins of the Industrial Revolution. Yourself, and I think Mokyr is an inspiration to something called progress studies, which is sort of a movement that I'm aware of from some podcasts and sort of some people I follow on Twitter. Are you part of this movement called progress studies? And if so, how would you describe it?
I guess I'm certainly not by design. It's not like I got my membership card in the post or anything, but I definitely consider myself to be sort of within that umbrella term. I guess progress studies, well, a lot of it originated from a particular piece co-authored by Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe, a financial payments company, where they argued that there's a slowdown in innovation today, and we need to understand the causes of innovation, the causes of living standards improving, causes of economic growth, in order to kind of restart things, to get living standards growing again. And that, I think, acted as a sort of a lightning rod for a lot of people who were already doing a lot of work, like myself, to find one another and kind of, when you have a label like that, it's easier to get in touch with people who are doing similar work. So I don't think it's a movement as such. I don't think it's necessarily even a field of study as such, but it is a kind of a loose label that I think gets applied to people, often pretty accurately, as to people who care about studying invention, innovation, economic growth. Because actually a lot of that stuff wasn't the kind of the main focus even just a few years ago, that you'd have a lot more focus on various other economic issues. A lot of the debates around growth wouldn't necessarily look at innovation at all. I find that there are quite a few historians of technology. Very few of them look at causes of invention. Most of them look at impacts of invention, and that's totally fine. But it's it does show that if you look at the trends over the past few decades, very few people are looking at very particular fields of study.
On progress studies, I suppose you're saying it's a new sort of school of thought. It doesn't necessarily have a monoculture when it comes to sort of ideas about how the economy should function. And I have to say, I'm very, I love all those graphs that show that child mortality was 50% in almost every civilization until the Industrial Revolution happened, and now it's like 4%. Like I think this is all incredibly persuasive. I'm generally pro progress. I suppose I do sense that on the progress studies side, there is a bit of a bias towards libertarianism and sort of saying this is what we want is low taxes, small states, limited regulations. And to me, that's the part of it I find less persuasive, because I feel like actually often you do need very big states. If you look at China, actually I was going to ask you about that, sort of what Mokyr would say about China, where you have a lot of influence from the state in directing people. What part of the economy do we think it's useful to you for you to be working in? So, for example, sort of they saw too many people were going into finance and consumer tech, and they thought this is a bit pointless. Let's discourage people from going into that. And now the best and the brightest in China go into engineering or green tech, for example. And I mean, there's a lot of questions in here, but I suppose, do you see progress studies as tied up with libertarianism as an ideology? And if so, I suppose, what are your responses to someone like me who sees that as a limited way of looking at progress?
So I actually don't think so at all. I do think there is an overlap between people who maybe used to be libertarians or are coming from a more libertarian background, who are interested in those sorts of ideas, who I think have then kind of shifted over. Just, I think, because their interests have often changed. One thing I actually find, kind of interesting about a lot of those people is very often they've become sort of agnostic about state involvement, or have even become quite pro-state involvement. Looking at the exact tinkering of how, really dry stuff. I mean, to me, maybe personally, but things like how exactly, given you have a grants, making program where government is funding invention indirectly through kind of arm's length body. How should that arm's length body precisely, hand out those graphs? How should it be organising these things? A lot of people who I think would originally have been classical liberals, libertarians, are kind of now working on those sorts of questions, which to me doesn't make me think, oh, there's definitely kind of ideologues are trying to push a particular point of view through that. Far from it, very often. Definitely a lot of work that's going into, precisely how do you tinker with the tax regime, not necessarily in terms of lower taxes, but just how do you reorganize for given, if you target a particular amount of revenue, how do you reorganize it so that it's pro-growth? A lot of the work that I've seen, I think, from, again, people originally from that background, is probably to my mind, certainly along those lines. And I think maybe part of that's a lot of maybe the route into libertarianism is sometimes via economics, because you're learning kind of about the world in a very different way, very unusual, often counterintuitive kind of way that leads you down those ideas. And then it's kind of falling back on those original aspects, which is actually then leading into how it is, or why it is, that so many people who seem to have been from those backgrounds are now in progress studies as well. So I don't think, certainly I'm sure some people are still ideological libertarians who kind of label themselves as progress studies people. But personally, I wouldn't say that the label or the umbrella is kind of even dominated in any particular way by that group.
They all have the Adam Smith Institute on their CVs, but you're saying often they've moderated to become a bit more agnostic about the state, sort of as they've looked into how invention actually happens. Yeah,
and that's possibly it, right? As well, is that maybe maybe we need one of those dictums for it's if you're not a socialist in your teens, then you have no heart. If you're not a conservative in your 40s, then you have no brain. Maybe there needs to be a kind of other one. If you're not a libertarian in your teens, then something or other. If you're not a progress studies person in your 40s, then maybe there has to be a slightly different version of that written up.
No, there's hope. Let's end on an issue about progress itself. As I say, I'm generally very open-minded to the idea that progress has happened and it's good. Those charts where you see the infant mortality falling, where you see the life expectancy going up, these are good things. Just because innovation, sort of in general, has been good up to now, though, doesn't necessarily mean it will be good forever into the future. I think there are some fairly persuasive arguments that sort of innovation, while it has been, pretty uncontroversial. It hasn't been uncontroversially good. That would be an unreasonable thing to say. But it's difficult to argue when you look at those graphs that this hasn't been a good thing. Progress, right? But we are reaching a point, the singularity, one might say, where innovation and technological change could end up getting so powerful that it eats us all. And actually, a related thing here, I think, is that lots of the progress studies people, as far as I understand, are in Silicon Valley. And actually, lots of the technologies that have come out of Silicon Valley over the past 10 or 20 years, I think are key examples of technological advancements which it is difficult to argue have sort of radically improved our lives. I'm thinking of all the kids addicted to their smartphones and all the people on social media wasting hours on a company which is just trying to steal their attention. So do you think there's an interesting argument that progress studies has arisen at exactly the moment when innovation as a sort of good in and of itself becomes most questionable?
Hard to say. I'm not a soothsayer. I'm certainly not a fortune teller. One thing, as a historian, though, that I can talk about the past, but I can't really talk about the future. One thing I do find very funny is that you almost see identical complaints like literally at any point in human history. I mean, this has just happened off the top of my head. Just the other day, I was reading a tract in the 1530s complaining about, the kind of 1530s equivalent of smartphones and people being addicted, and it's singing. And I'm like, how? Surely it can't just be that people are, spending all their time singing, and then it's a few decades later, it's people playing, doing bowling because they'd start betting on the bowl, who would win, and so the betting was like the bit that was seen as sinful. And they're talking about, no one's doing their work because they're just going to the bowling alley all the time. This is 1550s, 1560s, and then a few years, around that time, you've also got people playing at dice or playing at cards. Was it 20 years ago, people were worried about computer games completely taking over, and now computer games are almost seen as this kind of almost slightly retro thing that adults are really into, and kids, I guess, they have particular ones that they're into, like Fortnite or Minecraft or whatever. But I think these worries about people's attention spans, their worries about what they're up to. Yeah, maybe we've hit on the really, really bad one that's going to completely take over everything. But at the same time, I guess I have a bit of faith in society to kind of push back against these things. The fact that we're even having this conversation right now while using a technology that's been only invented in the past 10 or so years, talking over kind of video link, which 20 years ago would have seemed you had to have a really, really expensive piece of kit to be able to do that, while also complaining about the fact that the kids these days can't take their eyes away from their screens. Maybe kind of, to me, tells me that the actual demand for these technologies does tend to shift over time, that people do start to kind of say, oh, maybe I don't want that as much, and then they just stop buying that thing, or they stop using that thing, or they come up with ways to get around it. I guess my very optimistic point of view, and again, I'm not a fortune teller, my optimistic point of view is that usually we invent something that's pretty bad for a while until we invent the next thing that undoes the bad effects of it.
Until we invent the one that actually does kill us all.
Until there is the one that actually ends everything.
Everything's a moral panic until the one that isn't, sort of by definition.